Hi, Andres, I just emailed you links to all the PDF files. So if you could just forward them to everybody or put them on the IEC website. Okay, where we left off yesterday, we were running through some basic examples. Jose kind of went through probably more quickly than I will, some of what I'll talk about today. So some of this will be redundant with what he told you yesterday, but you'll hear it a little more slowly from me. So for those of you who are newer to this, it might still be useful for the rest of you. I apologize for the redundancy. But so we'll go through these examples, then we'll talk about an important area of Bayesian inference called multi-level modeling or hierarchical Bayes or graphical modeling. Those are all names for the same thing. And then we'll talk a little bit about computational methods for low-dimensional Bayesian models. Okay, so where we left off was we had just done inference with a binomial distribution, and now I want to talk about the normal distribution. So you all know about Gaussians. We did these examples yesterday, and then Jose, of course, gave you lots of examples of Gaussians. So just to remind you of the notation, here it is, the well-known bell curve. The location parameter, where the mean and the mode happen to be, both be, is mu. The sample is x, the sample value is x, the standard deviation is sigma, and this is that standard twiddle notation that statisticians like to use. So just a reminder, the parameters, mu is the moment, so the integral of x times p of x, and then the variance is just the second moment of the difference between x and its mean value. All right, so we suppose we have some data d. Each measurement d sub I is the mean value, like the magnitude of a star or something like that, plus some additive noise. And we're going to suppose the noise contributions are independent, each uncertain with a probability distributed like the normal distribution with mean 0 and some variance sigma squared. So then the probability for the whole set of n data samples is the product of n independent probabilities. The probability for the value that we see for a particular datum is just the probability that the noise makes up the difference, that epsilon is equal to d minus mu. By assumption, our probability distribution for epsilon is a zero mean normal, so we just have a product of lots of normal distributions. The exponents all add, so in the exponent we get something that I've called q of mu, a function of the parameter mu. It's the sum of these numerators divided by this denominator 2 sigma squared. And then, of course, we get the product of all these normalization constants out front. By now, you're familiar with the idea of a likelihood function, and what's important in the likelihood function is the dependence on the parameters. If all we're interested in mu, all we care about is this, and we could drop all of this. But if sigma is unknown, then we have to keep this stuff. It's worth highlighting because you'll probably recognize this thing here. The sum of all these, the sum of the data minus the predicted value for the data, squared divided by sigma squared is chi squared, our familiar chi squared. So this is just e to the minus chi squared over 2. If you know the sigmas, that's all you need to know. But if you don't know the sigmas, then you need to have this term out front. All right. So we have this function of mu. So let's focus on mu for now. I've left to the supplement what to do when sigma is unknown. We'll bring that up briefly again later. So here's what that q is, and I use the symbol q for quadratic to signify quadratic because it's quadratic in mu. It'll have mu squared terms in it. So the sum of d minus mu squared, well, we'll just expand that square. So d squared, mu squared minus 2, d times mu, all summed. So this is independent of mu. It's just some sum of the data squared. This is n copies of mu squared. And this, we could pull out the mu because it doesn't depend on the sum index I. And then the sum of the data is just n times the mean of the data. So we have 2 times n times mu times the mean of the data. So now we're going to try to make this a perfect square in mu. So we'll write this, we'll pull out this factor n and write this as n times mu minus d bar squared so that we get this cross term here. So if we're to square this, we'll see an n mu squared. We'll see a minus 2n mu d bar. But then we'll also see an n d bar squared, so we have to subtract that off. So hopefully you remember all this, maybe even from high school, completing the square. I'm just going through it because when you do Bayesian inference with normal distribution errors, completing the square is kind of your life's work. So just a couple weeks ago, I was working on a project with some colleagues doing photogrammetry of Enceladus, and I spent a whole afternoon and several pages of notes just completing squares. So just wanted to make sure you remember what all this looks like and what the answer looks like. So the answer is this quadratic form, this thing that looked like chi-squared, you can write as the parameter mu minus some estimate of the parameter d bar squared plus some piece that's left over. So this piece plus this piece you can write as the sum of the data minus the predicted value for the data d bar squared. So this the piece that's left over from this perfect square piece is just the residual squared. So n times the average squared residual. All right. So this is something that Jose alluded to yesterday. The likelihood function here depends on the data, those n values of data, only through their mean and through this residual, the sum of the data minus the mean squared. So in statistics terminology, we say that the sample mean and its variance here are sufficient statistics. And I just want to emphasize something again that Jose alluded to yesterday. We came upon the idea of sufficient statistics first in the Bernoulli problem, where if I handed you a whole sequence of n results of heads or tails or galaxy or star or whatever, all you needed to know was the number of one type to do inference with a Bernoulli or a binomial likelihood function. Here with a Gaussian likelihood function, I can observe a star 1,000,000 times and want to try to learn its mean magnitude, and all I need to tell you about those 1,000,000 numbers are d bar and r squared. And I just want to emphasize something that Jose also mentioned yesterday, that this kind of thing is just a miraculous compression of information, and it's entirely model dependent, and the normal distribution is highly abnormal in this respect. Jose gave you an example yesterday of the Cauchy distribution where this doesn't happen. Basically, anything outside the exponential family where the prediction appears linearly in an exponent-like term, anything outside of that, you don't have this kind of compression of information. A lot of frequentist statistics relies heavily on this because it makes the calculations much simpler. Some parts of frequentist statistics conceptually require some kind of compression like this. But it's not necessary, but certainly extremely convenient when you're doing Bayesian calculations. All right, so now suppose we want to estimate the mean. So we have this same setup. The data are the mean plus the noise, zero mean noise. And let's suppose sigma is known for now, so that our background information is the model specification, that everything's Gaussian with the known sigma. And so we're going to try to estimate mu. So from the Bayesian point of view, that means we want to find the posterior distribution for mu. So we already know the likelihood function. This is just copied from the previous slide. We're interested only in mu now. We're saying we know sigma, so we can drop the things that mu doesn't appear in. That's all this stuff here. So you just have e to the minus a perfect square in mu, centered at d bar. So we need a prior, and there are several arguments that have been offered for trying to find some kind of default prior. This problem has a translation invariance to it, where if you shift all the data and the parameters then by the same amount, then the problem looks the same. If you require the prior to reflect that same symmetry, then the prior has to be a constant. The reference prior argument that Jose will explain to you more in detail on Thursday also leads to a constant prior here. As Jose already told you about yesterday, this prior is improper. That's just the phrase to say that it's not normalizable over the entire domain of mu, the real line, unless it's bounded. So formally, whenever you're doing these kinds of things, the safest way to proceed is to put boundaries on the prior and make it proper. Do your calculation and see in the end if your final result behaves well in the limit that the boundaries go to infinity. And at the end of this talk, I'll have a list of problems, homework problems I recommend that you do. And one of them is to do that exercise for this problem. I'm going to skip it, but you need to have done it a few times so that you'll develop some sense of when it's likely to happen or not. And it's something you always need to be careful about. There's an interesting set of arguments in the literature. They're not totally convincing, but that suggests that if you want a prior to express ignorance, that in some sense it almost should be improper, in the sense that you want it to be something that doesn't let you make inferences when you don't have any data. So in that sense, it might not be surprising that a prior that expresses ignorance is improper. But that's just kind of a hand-wavy idea, but it has some appeal to the intuition. All right, so we have a likelihood of prior. Now we need the normalization constant in the denominator. So we integrate this likelihood times the prior. And you know how to integrate a Gaussian, probably. Remember, the normalization constant of a Gaussian is root 2 times its standard deviation. Here, the standard deviation, well, the variance is sigma squared over n, if I were to bring n down here. So the standard deviation is sigma over root n. So this is our prior predictive. If you were doing this with a proper prior, this constant would be 1 over the width of the prior. The integral would be over some finite domain, and you'd have error functions appearing in here that are chopping off the tails on each side. So the posterior, happily, that c appears both in the prior and in the normalization constant, so it cancels. And that's what makes the improper prior okay here, in some sense. So here's our posterior. It's just a Gaussian distribution for mu centered at d bar, but now with a width sigma over root n instead of sigma. So it's just a normal distribution. In that statistics notation, it's normal with mean d bar, and with some width w, that's sigma over root n. The 68% highest posterior density region is just the mean plus or minus sigma over root n. And so it's all pretty straightforward. But I just wanted you to see the algebra in detail. So now let's generalize a little bit, and let's introduce an informative prior, something that's not flat. So suppose the prior for mu was itself a normal distribution, centered at some value mu naught, and with some width w naught. It might be the result of a previous experiment like this, and now we're monitoring the star again, and so we want to pool our new data with the old data. Or it might be from some kind of, maybe you had some argument for what the mean and the variance might be, and then a maximum entropy argument might then tell you that this is a good prior distribution. It turns out this is a conjugate prior in the same sense that we talked about yesterday with the beta distribution and the binomial likelihood. That if I take this as the prior and I have a Gaussian likelihood, then the posterior stays Gaussian. It's in the Gaussian family. So the posterior now is a normal distribution with some mean mu twiddle and some with W twiddle. But the mean and the standard deviation now have changed a little bit from the previous slide. They're no longer at the mean of the data and with a width of sigma over root n. To tell you what the values are, let's introduce this constant here, b. B for bias, that's the mnemonic for b. That's just the previous width squared, the flat prior width, sigma over root n squared, divided by the same w plus w naught. So w naught, it's the standard deviation of a normal, so it has to be positive. So that means b is always less than 1. When the prior width is very large, in the limit of infinite w0, this prior becomes flat. So in that limit, b is 0. Right. And when w0 gets very small, then b is 1. So in terms of this, this constant b, mu twiddle is the sample mean plus b times the prior mean minus the sample mean. So in other words, this is, when I have this prior at mu naught, I get pulled a little towards that mu naught. How much I get pulled towards there depends on the ratio of sigma over root n to my prior width. And similarly, the width of the posterior now is a little narrower. I've added information. I have an informative prior, so for the Gaussian, that ends up meaning that the posterior will be narrower by a factor of square root 1 minus b. Jimmy Savage, just a very famous Bayesian statistician from the mid-20th century, liked to make note of the fact that as long as the prior the prior scale, W naught, is significantly larger than the likelihood scale, W, then B will be near 0, and this term here will be small, and this term here will be near 1. So the result will be that if you have a prior that's relatively broad with respect to your likelihood, then you're not your results are not sensitive to the details of the prior, and he called that the principle of stable estimation, or the principle of precise measurement. It's just the point that a broad prior doesn't affect your results. So here's just some examples of that. So green shows the prior, red shows the likelihood function. So have two cases here. In both of them, the prior is centered at 10, and the data have a mean of 3 with sigma over root n with 1. So here the prior is broad. It has a width of 5. And the posterior, this blue curve here, hardly changes. Here the prior is significantly narrower. It has a width of 2, not too much different than the width of the likelihood, which is 1. And so the posterior here, you see, shifts more significantly from the likelihood. Still not dramatically, but significantly. One thing worth pointing out here, and Jose alluded to this a little yesterday as well. The normal distribution, despite its name, is abnormal in several respects. We already highlighted one, which is that it invokes this incredible compression of information in sufficient statistics. Another one here is that, if you were to look at this just kind of qualitatively yourself, here's your prior, here's what your data are saying in the likelihood function, they seem discrepant. And so you might think that inferences should reflect that by somehow either being broader or maybe having 2 bumps. And there are likelihoods for which that will happen, but the normal isn't one of them. A property of the normal in this setup we've already mentioned, it's conjugate, so the posterior has to be normal. So one particularly weird thing about this situation here, the prior seems discrepant with the data, but the posterior is higher than in this case, where the prior seem to agree more with the data. Higher means it's narrower. So It's narrower because the prior was narrower, and so it's just a property of the normal that when you combine two narrower things, you get a narrower result than if you combine a narrow thing with a wide thing. So this is probably not a desirable property of the normal, and so it might not be, you know, if that bothers you for a problem you're working on, it suggests that there's something in your problem, either the prior or the likelihood, that's not reflecting reality. But so it's worth noting that about the normal distribution, that your posterior is always narrower than either the prior or the likelihood in the normal setup, and that might not be kind of what you want to happen. Now, suppose sigma is unknown. So as Jose mentioned yesterday, what you do is you treat sigma as a parameter. You keep those terms we dropped out of the likelihood function, and you integrate over them, and you get students' t distribution. And Jose showed it to you in 3 lines, but if you look in the supplement, you'll see a little more detail if you've never did it. And it's worth going through that calculation. That'll be another one of my recommended homework items at the end. We just don't have time to go through it in the lecture, but I did. It's something everybody should know about, the student's t distribution. This is very closely related to the idea that comes up quite often in astronomy, where you think that you might have some estimated measurement errors, some variances for the noise in your experiment, but you think there are additional sources. And one way you might try to handle them is you'll calculate a chi-squared, and you'll just inflate all the noise so that chi-squared, the reduced chi-squared, is 1. That's what this does, but in a rigorous way. And instead of just plugging in the new sigma that makes chi-squared 1, it actually makes things a little wider to take into account the fact that you're uncertain in sigma. You don't know that its value is exactly the one that makes reduced chi-squared equal to 1. But you suspect it's probably in that vicinity. And this marginalization procedure takes into account that uncertainty and essentially plugs in an estimate, but then also makes everything a little wider. Worth knowing how to do. All right, so let's do a different nuisance parameter problem. Let's do background subtraction. So we imagine we measure some background rate, like we look off source, and we get some estimate of the background and some uncertainty for it, sigma b. Then we'll look on source, where there's a total rate. That's the signal plus the background, and we'll get some estimate for the total rate. So these two things come from the data. B hat and R hat are functions of the data, sigma R and sigma B. Now we want to infer the source strength. Well, if we have flat priors and Gaussian likelihoods, we know that the posterior, the joint posterior for the source in the background will be kind of this prior for the background times this piece for the source plus background, the total rate term, source plus background minus the total rate estimate. So now we have a joint posterior distribution for the background and the signal parameters. So how do we summarize what the data tell us only about the signal, including in our summary all the uncertainty about the background? We marginalize over B, and so I skipped some algebra, but I showed you the algebra, that slide where we went through completing the square. You do the same thing here. Complete the square in B, because we're going to be integrating over B. Complete the square in B, and then you'll get a Gaussian in B that you can integrate over, and some constants come out of that. And then the piece that's left is an S piece, S-dependent piece. You'll have to complete the square in that, and the final result probably is no surprise that it's normal in S. The estimated signal is just the estimated total rate minus the background estimate, and the uncertainty follows the familiar propagation of error rule, where you sum the variances and then take the square root. So you already know this. You learned this from the familiar Taylor series propagation of error stuff you learned probably in third-year lab or something like that as an undergrad. So why am I telling it to you here? Well, I just wanted to show you, the Bayesian version of that, but also to emphasize that background subtraction is a special case of background marginalization. So the fundamental thing to do is, if there's something that you're not interested in but that you need to include in the problem, and you want to get rid of it but account for its uncertainty, you marginalize over it. It just so happens that in a Gaussian setting, that tells you to subtract the best fit estimates. But there's nothing in that formulation, that marginalization approach, that tells you that the result will always be a subtraction. In a few minutes, we'll see a case where it isn't. The fundamental thing is marginalization. So the propagation of error approach that you learned, you might recall, is based on Taylor expansion type arguments. The formal statistical development of this is called the delta method. If you ever have to look it up in a frequentist statistics book, that's what it's called, referring to deltas in the sense of small deviations from the peak. Marginalization provides a generalization of error propagation, but there's no approximations involved. The marginalization idea doesn't require things to be Gaussian. It doesn't require things to be linear with respect to your parameters as they were trivially here. The idea applies completely generally. Now, that said, so it's totally straightforward to write down what you need to do. To actually evaluate the integrals when they're more complicated than this, that's another matter. That can be hard. And that's the subject of my last lecture and much of what Brendan will tell you about. So just a quick couple slides connecting this to chi-squared minimization and least squares, weighted least squares. So suppose your data are measurements of not of a constant now, but of some underlying function at some sample points x, and the function depends on some unknown parameters theta. I'm letting f sub I be the value of the function at the location of the ith datum. So our data are just the function plus some additive noise, and we'll now let the noise have a different standard deviation for each sample. And we'd like to learn about theta or compare different models. So the likelihood, as I've already alluded to in the constant function case, the likelihood is just a product of normals, and the thing that appears in the exponent is just what appears in chi-squared. So as long as the noise scales are known, you just have e to the minus chi-squared over 2. So Bayesian inference in terms of curve fitting, regression with Gaussian additive noise just looks a lot like chi-squared. The difference mainly being that now we're going to be interested in integrals of this over theta, not in how this thing varies when I simulate different data sets. So the posterior is just going to be some prior for the parameters, e to the minus chi-squared over 2. So if you already have a chi-squared code, just think of chi-squared as minus twice the log of the likelihood function, and then you need to do exploration and integration of that. And we'll talk a little more about how to do that. There's an important special case of this that's worth highlighting. It's called, in the operations research literature, this class of models is called separable nonlinear models. So these are classes of models where the parameters divide into two classes. There's some set of amplitudes A, so these are both vectors, and some set of nonlinear parameters that I've written as psi here. Linear amplitudes A, nonlinear parameters psi. So an example would be a superposition of sinusoids, where the weights of all the sinusoids are the amplitudes, and then the frequencies are the nonlinear parameters psi. So the function is a linear superposition of m nonlinear components. I'm writing those as g, so those would be the sines and cosines. And I'm labeling the model components as alpha, so the data index I goes from 1 to n. The model components go from 1 to m. They have some amplitudes. So why is this special class of models important? We could just plug this into what we just showed you and do, treat all these parameters as regular parameters and do all the Bayesian computation stuff. But what's interesting here is that because these parameters appear, have a linear role in the function, you can marginalize over them analytically. So you can analytically reduce the dimensionality of your model. And when you're doing Bayesian computation, anything that you can do to reduce the dimensions that you have to integrate numerically is a helpful thing. So, so learning how to do this is worth doing. It involves, doing eigenfunction or single value decomposition in linear algebra. It's not hard. It's pretty straightforward. I didn't want to spend time doing it here. It's sometimes referred to as the Bretthorst algorithm. Larry Bretthorst, a student of Ed James, worked out all the details in this book. And in the PDF file, the blue line is because this is a link, because the book is available online, so you can get all the details online. All right. So we did the binomial distribution, where probability is related to frequency, the number of the fraction of cases that turn out one way or another. We did the normal distribution, which arises often as a model of additive noise. Now I want to talk about the Poisson distribution, which comes up in many guises in astronomy. The two main ones being photon or particle counting experiments, or population analyses, where I'm just counting luminosity functions, numbers of galaxies per interval of luminosity, or I'm counting, star densities, things like that. Counts of something that's distributed according to some density function that's not normalized to 1. It has some units like number of galaxies per unit volume in space or something like that. So it's going to relate the rates, that density, and counts of objects distributed according to that density. So this is just to remind you what the Poisson distribution looks like. And to be concrete, let's imagine we're just talking about the rate of something per unit time. So photons coming in a telescope with unit projected area as a function of time. So there's some rate, and there's always, in these problems, there's always some kind of underlying density. Here it's the rate, it's numbers of events per unit time, and then there's always some interval that describes the observations. Here it's the duration of the observations. It might be your exposure at the telescope, so it would be the interval there is time times area. If you're surveying a population, the interval might be just volume in space. I do a lot of work with gamma ray bursts, so that's a transient population, so there's both volume in space and interval in time. How many bursts per year happen in some volume of the universe? So there's a rate per some interval, and then there's an observation interval. So the Poisson distribution says that, which will appear as our likelihood function. The data will be some counts of events or objects. The unknown parameter is the rate or the density, and then the likelihood function, the probability for the number of counts in an interval, is just the rate times the interval size to the power n over n factorial, and then e to the minus rate times the interval size. So rate times interval size is just the expected number of counts, which can be a real number. It generally will be a real number, non-integer. But the number of counts is an integer. And then here's a link to a paper that has a particularly clear derivation of this in this context. Ed James also has a book with this title. This is referring to the paper, not the book. The derivation might be, I couldn't remember if it was in the book or not. But it's in this paper. He presented it at a MaxEnt meeting in 1989, which was the first Bayesian meeting I went to. It's where I met Ed, and we became friends. And so I heard him present this paper, and it appears in this volume where my first Bayesian paper appears, so I have lots of good memories associated with this paper. And it's just a really nice derivation of the Poisson distribution. All right. So for the prior, I'm showing you here actually 3 different standard choices for what to use for the prior. When you know that the rate is non-zero and the rate is setting some kind of scale in the problem, Ed James and Harold Jeffries both suggested, they made note of the fact that the problem then has a scale invariance, where if I change all my intervals by some factor, then all the distributions still look the same. If I measure time in minutes instead of seconds, but then express my rate per minute instead of per second, everything looks the same. If you want the prior to respect that invariance, then the prior should be flat in log r. So in terms of r, it's proportional to 1 over r. It's worth, if you don't remember Jacobians and transformations, it's worth showing yourself that. On the other hand, if the rate of the source might be 0, if you don't even know if there's a source there, then it can't set a scale, because scales are something you divide by, but if it can be 0, you can't divide by it. And there, another argument you might invoke to try to come up with some idea of ignorance is you might say, well, then over some large interval of possible numbers of events, I might want ignorance to mean that my probability for the number of events should be constant over some large interval. That I don't expect there to be 10 events. My probability for 10 events is not greater than for 1 event or for 100 events. If you do that, that's just like Bayes' motivation for a flat prior for the binomial case, the Bernoulli case. Here it involves, you can use properties of the Laplace transform to show that means that the prior has to be constant. I wrote a proper version of it here. You should set an upper limit. The lower limit is naturally 0. But you should set an upper limit and do the calculation, and then see at the end if it's okay for that upper limit to go to infinity, and it is here. But, it's worth doing the exercise. The reference prior for this, which Jose probably will, I don't know if he'll derive it for you, but I think he already told you yesterday that the reference prior for this was root r. Yeah, so, but you'll at least learn, if not this particular derivation, you'll learn what goes into this reference prior idea on Thursday. So right now, let's just use the flat prior. So here's the likelihood function, expected number to the n, e to the minus expected number n factorial. The prior, here I did use a proper prior, so going to r upper. So here's the integral. Now I inserted a t here and then divided by a t here. So this is a dx, x to the n, e to the minus x. That might ring bells for some of you. That's just the integral form of n factorial if this had been infinite, if the upper limit had been infinite. So as long as r upper is larger than where this integrand peaks, then this will be approximately n factorial. And that cancels this n factorial, so the normalization constant is just 1 over r upper times the observing interval. So I now have everything. I have the prior, 1 over r upper, the likelihood, and then this thing. And the r upper cancels. And so that's a hint as to why the infinite limit is okay. You really should show it explicitly. And so here's the posterior. We had a flat prior, so of course it looks like the likelihood function. If I had hidden this t, this looks just like a Poisson distribution, which would be a normalized distribution for the integer n. But now this is a posterior distribution for the real number t. So this has to be normalized over t. And that's what over r. Sorry, little r here. And that's what this t does. It makes it normalized over r. This thing has a name. It's called a gamma distribution. That's another family of distributions that you need to know about that will come up a lot in Bayesian inference. So a gamma distribution is a 2-parameter family for over positive valued variable. It has this shape parameter alpha and a scale parameter lambda, or sometimes it's written in terms of the inverse scale. I denoted epsilon. So here's what it looks like. You can ignore the constants. The constants are where it gets its name. The normalization constant depends on the gamma function, the generalization of a factorial to non-integers. So it's a power law with an exponential cutoff. That's what you need to know. And if you're familiar, if you're an extragalactic astronomer, you know about Schechter functions, power laws with exponential cutoffs. Or if you're a high-energy astronomer, you've probably modeled spectra with power laws with exponential cutoffs. Those are gamma functions. The Schechter function is a case where so I should have given you the allowed values for alpha. Alpha has to be bigger than 0 for this to be proper. For the Schechter function, that corresponds to alpha being slightly negative, a very steep power law. So there has to be a lower cutoff. We always ignore it in astronomy for galaxy studies because there's always a selection effect that cuts off at low luminosities. But you would need to include it explicitly here. But anyway, so it's just to say this has a fancy name and a fancy expression, but it's just power law times exponential cutoff. It has moments that can be calculated analytically. Interesting summaries are the mode is at the number of events divided by the interval length. It's just kind of where you would expect it. The mean is slightly shifted. Both of these get shifted down by 1 in n if you use the 1 over r prior instead of the flat prior. And then standard deviation is pretty much what you'd expect. It's root n kind of thing, root n over the interval, root n. So this is just a plot of it. It's always a slightly skew distribution, though as the number of counts gets larger and larger, it looks more symmetric and Gaussian. So that's what it looks like. This problem, too, has a conjugate prior. Not all problems have conjugate priors, but the ones we happen to be doing as simple examples do. Note that the gamma distribution prior is r to a power e to the minus r times something, and the likelihood function is r to a power e to the minus r times something. So their product is r to a sum of the powers and then e to the minus r sum of the multipliers. So if the likelihood is Poisson and the prior is gamma, then the posterior is gamma, and that's what you mean when you say something's conjugate, that the posterior has the same form as the prior with a particular likelihood function. So that's the simple Gaussian case. Let's do a little more complicated one, but I just want to point out one thing, that one convention that I like to follow in my papers when I do these kinds of things is to, when I'm using non-informative priors, is to plot the posterior with an abscissa that makes the prior flat. So in this case, the case I just did with a flat prior, I would just plot the posterior as a function of r. But if I had used the 1 over r prior, I would plot the posterior as a function of log r, change variables so everything looks like log r. In the log r space, the prior is flat. And that way you're showing the reader the likelihood function, but in a way so that it can be interpreted as a probability density. But that also means that if they are wondering what the answers would look like with a different prior, all they have to do is kind of in their heads or in their computer modulate that plot by whatever other prior they're interested in looking at. It's just a useful convention when you're using vague priors for things. All right, so let's do a slightly more complicated one. This one's interesting because it's really not a complicated problem, but it had defied frequentist statistics for a long time. So when I was a graduate student in the 80s, so before some of you were born, the day that I understood marginalization, I did this problem. Because it was a problem that I'd struggled with as a graduate student. I was doing high-energy astrophysics, gamma-ray astronomy, X-ray astronomy, where we have lots of low photon count rate things. And we'd had an issue with doing background subtraction with low numbers of counts, and there had been some methods published that tried to be fancier than just subtracting background estimates, which sometimes gives you a negative answer. But they all had unsatisfactory properties. And so the day the light bulb finally went off, oh, that's what marginalization means, I did this problem. And it turned out nobody had yet done it when I did it. And at the same time I was doing it, Harrison Prosper in particle physics was doing it, and he actually published it a few months before I did. But the point was, it was a simple problem to do, something a graduate student who never had a statistics course could do. The only reason it hadn't been done was purely conceptual. It was purely that, frequentist statisticians did not want to talk about probabilities for parameters. As soon as you allowed yourself that conceptual freedom, then the problem becomes doable. So how do you do it? So you look off source, and there's some unknown background rate b, and you count n off photons in some time interval t off. Then look on source, where you now have a total rate signal parameter s plus the background parameter b with the signal rate unknown, and you have some on source number of photons n on in the interval t on. And so you now just want to infer S, and by now you all know what you should do. You should formulate the problem in terms of S and B, but then get rid of B by marginalization. The conventional solution was just to estimate B with N off divided by T off, estimate the total rate, N on divided by T on, and then subtract those. This can sometimes be negative, and when you do propagation of errors, sometimes even the whole error bar ends up negative. So the week I did this, I just went to AppJ and looked for the first paper that had gamma ray in the title, and this is what I found. This is a plot of the gamma ray flux of sig x1 as a function of its X-ray flux, and these authors were trying to find what the correlation was between them. So here's the plot, and here's the gamma ray estimates, and this is 0. So 2 of these points are, the estimate is negative. For this one, the entire error bar is negative, yet they felt okay drawing this straight line through those points, which is probably not an accurate thing. So this was a case where there's low numbers of counts. But one point I'd like to emphasize is that in some sense, there's always a low number of counts. So here, many years later, Chandra is flying. We're getting more counts in X-rays than we've ever had before, millions of X-ray photons. So here's a paper on a Chandra source. I should remember what this source was. I can't remember the name of it. It's a source with an accretion disk, and the accretion disk can be modeled as kind of the usual superposition of thermal emission across the disk, so a range of temperatures. It gives you some big peak. But the interest in this paper was on whether there's a hot corona around the disk. And that gives you a power law, kind of a power law component to the spectrum. So the entire interest in this paper, even though Chandra had these millions of photons, the entire interest of this paper is this. So yeah, there's millions of photons, but as soon as you get millions of photons, then you ask new questions that depend on, small amounts of data in the regions that you're now able to probe now that you have more and more photons. Another area I've worked in recently is cosmic ray astrophysics. And so here's the cosmic ray spectrum. We have millions of cosmic ray events measured across the spectrum, but the main focus of the cosmic ray literature is out here at the very highest end. You might know there's fundamental physics involved in the shape of this spectrum, and whether there's a cutoff here has to do with the interaction of cosmic rays with the microwave background radiation. So yeah, there's millions of cosmic rays, but there's only a few dozen over here, and that's where a lot of the attention of the field is. So Andrew Gelman had this nice blog post about this. Sample sizes are never large. N is never large is the title of the post. If it's too small, you need to get more data, but once you get more data, you start subdividing the data to learn more. N is never enough, because if it were enough, you'd already be on to the next problem, for which you need more data. He also said you never have quite enough money, but that's another story. N is never large, whether it's euros or photons. So how do we do this? So we'll first look off source, and we'll try to estimate B. And you know what that is. It's just that gamma distribution posterior that we had before. Now it's in terms of B instead of R, and with N off and T off over here. And we're going to use this as a prior to analyze the on-source data. So on-source will now have this Poisson distribution for the total rate, S plus B, with N on photons in time T on, e to the minus S plus B T on. We'll use a flat prior for S, and we'll use our off-source prior for B, our off-source posterior as the prior for B. So this thing here is a B to the N off and an e to the minus B T off. So when I can, put all those terms in here, and here's what the joint posterior looks like. It's S plus B to the N on, so a power of S plus B. S appears in the exponent only multiplying T on, but B appears multiplying both T on and T off. Now we have to integrate this slightly messy thing over B. So that's what I did that day when I understood marginalization. I need to integrate this thing. This is just copying that over b. So there's b to a power, s plus b to a power. I can just expand this with the binomial theorem, and I'll get a sum of terms that are b to a power e to the minus b times something. And that should ring a bell now, right? So something to a power e to the minus that something is a gamma function. It's related to factorials. So you can do all those integrals. So there's some expression here that ends up being, what's left is powers of s and then e to the minus s, which I've copied here, powers of s, e to the minus s. And each of those gets multiplied by the value of that b integral, which involves lots of gamma functions. Now this is the answer. That's the Bayesian answer. You can calculate those coefficients analytically, but it has an appealing form. Like once you see it, you wonder why people wouldn't guess it, but nobody had guessed it. So this is just the posterior you would have if there were I is goes from 0 to the n on. If there were I photons that you could attribute to the source. So what the marginalization calculation is telling you to do is consider all n on photons and consider all the cases where 0, 1, 2, up to n on might be from the source. But just weight them all by this function here, which you can show is just the probability that that number came from the source. So it's a really kind of intuitively appealing answer. It does all the right things. I just show you some quick plots here. So imagine off source, we look for 1 second and we see n sources from our background. And then suppose on source we see some different numbers of photons. So if we look on source and we see 16 photons in 1 second, then this is what your posterior for S looks like. No big surprise. It peaks around 7, 16 minus 9. If you see 9 photons on source, which is consistent with what you saw just from the background, then the posterior peaks at 0. It kind of looks like half a Gaussian. It's actually broader than a Gaussian. But, if you saw only 6 source events, 6 photons on source, which is certainly possible with this small number of events to get a fluctuation like that, then the posterior looks like this. It still allows positive values of S, but it's more sure that they must be near 0. Now suppose off source instead you saw 90 photons in 10 seconds. So you still think the rate of the background is 9 events per second. But since you've looked for 10 seconds, you're now sure that the event must be closer to exactly 9 events a second. And then the green curves show the modified marginal posteriors. And they're in the same locations, but now they're all narrower. And that just reflects that you know the background better now. So you're able to more reliably estimate the signal strength. So it does the right thing. So in the supplement where I've deferred some details that I've mentioned all along, I've also given you 2 other ways to derive that result. One of them explicitly adopts this idea, well, I know some and possibly all of the on-source events might be due to the background. Why don't I just introduce that as a nuisance parameter? Introduce as a nuisance parameter the integer number of on-source events that are actually due to the source versus the background, and integrate over that. That's an approach called a missing data approach. It's imagining you had data that told you whether each event was from the source or not. And to account for it, the missing data, including your uncertainty about it, is a technique called data augmentation. And so the supplement works you through that analytically, and it's a key, doing it in a Monte Carlo way is a kind of key tool in Bayesian computation. So just a recap of the key ideas for these examples, the binomial one yesterday and normal and Poisson today. So repeatedly we've seen the idea of a sufficient statistic, a model-dependent condensation of the information in the data. We've talked about different ideas for default or relatively uninformative priors. You've learned about 3 different conjugate prior likelihood pairs, and we're going to talk about two of them in the next talk, beta, binomial, and gamma Poisson. A big emphasis was marginalization, which generalizes background subtraction and propagation of errors. The gray things are things that are talked about in the supplement. The likelihood principle, which we just briefly mentioned, and there's more on it in the supplement. And then some notable specific results are like this on-off method and the Brett-Horst algorithm, things that deserve some more attention. And then I just gave you a list here of things that I recommend you do. You might even want to try to do them these 2 weeks while there are people here who can help if you get stuck, and while the ideas are all fresh in your head. It's one thing to see people present stuff in a lecture. It's another to work out the details for yourself. So this is just, I highlighted many of these points in the course of the lecture as things you should try to do. And so this is just a list of them. All right, so let's take a 5-minute break and then come back to talk about hierarchical Bayes.